Launching a SaaS company, a software as a service product and company, is a really hot topic right now. And there's a reason why. With more and more companies turning to software to automate processes, streamline operations, SaaS products are really high in demand. So if you have a solution for an industry and you want to jump on the bandwagon and build your own product, you might be wondering, how do you build a SaaS company if you don't know how to code? I mean, what if you don't have a technical background? What do you do then when you have the solution, but you just don't necessarily have the means to get there? That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, make sure you stick around until the end, because if you're looking to build a SaaS product and you don't know how to code, we're going to be talking about everything from idea validation to different development paths you could take, all the way down to how to start thinking about your solution and even scoping it out so you can start building it, putting it into the hands of users, and launching your SaaS company. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can either launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding. Now, preface to this video, before we dive in, there are lots of ways you can go about building and launching an app and an app-based business, and lots of ways you can go about launching a SaaS company. And this video is geared specifically to help solo entrepreneurs or maybe small teams, partners who are looking to build a sustainable company that can help them potentially add a new revenue stream onto the jobs or the businesses they already have, or maybe move into this new business model in the form of an app. So maybe leave their career, leave what they're currently doing, and move into something that's really more scalable. These are people who are likely funding their projects, their businesses themselves, or maybe bringing in a little bit of outside funding in the beginning, maybe more later on. And really, they're looking to build new businesses to ultimately just change their lifestyles. Now, there's another group of entrepreneurs who are going at this trying to get really heavy investing up front and aren't really looking at profit margins, but are looking to grow their revenue as much as they can, as quickly as they can, so that they can exit really early and just jump over to the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. And for them, it's more about building the company versus building the lifestyle. And there's nothing wrong with that or the other. Each is perfectly fine. But caveat to this, we're looking more so at that first group who's really looking to build a business that can sustain them over the long run. Okay, so up to this point, you have likely identified a problem in your industry, or maybe an industry in which you have a lot of knowledge or connections, and you have a solution in mind for how to streamline a process or solve this problem. And now you want to turn it into a SaaS product, into an app-based business. So in this video, we're going to talk about the next 5 steps that you're going to be going through. First things first, we'll be looking at idea validation. So we want to make sure there is a need for the solution you've come up with. Second, we're going to talk about the development path you could take. So are you looking for a technical co-founder since you don't know how to code? Are you looking to outsource? Are you looking at alternative solutions like using no-code tools? If you're looking at using no-code tools, the third thing we're going to talk about is platform choice. How do you identify the right tool for yourself, for your app, and for your needs? After that, again, assuming you are looking into using no-code tools, the fourth thing we're going to talk about is the development path you could take with no-code tools. So are you going to build it yourself? Are you going to build it with someone else's help? Are you going to still outsource, but with no-code tools? We'll break down the pros and cons of each of those so you can make the right decision for you. And the fifth thing we're going to dive into is how to start thinking about your pilot app. What are the first steps you need to go into? And at the very end, we're also going to jump over to a worksheet, an extra training that you can go through and use to help you take the next steps as you move into the actual development with your app and your SaaS product. All right, so we're going to jump over to the whiteboard and draw some of this out. And first things first, we're going to talk about your idea validation. Now, there are lots of ways you can validate your idea, and the first layer of that is really your existing knowledge. So again, we talked about coming into this, having some experience with a problem or a system that just doesn't work or could work better. Ideally, you have that first layer of validation because you have the problem yourself, or maybe you work with people who have the problem you're solving. But there are areas you can look at beyond that. Now, validation can go very far and very wide. We're going to keep things simple in this video so you can lay the foundation for your validation of your idea and then move forward from there. And I want you to keep in mind there are two different types of validation. There's idea validation and there's product validation. Idea validation is when you're making sure there is a need for the solution you've come up with in the first place, and product validation is making sure you are solving the problem in the right way. So you're looking at not if the problem needs to be solved, but how it can be solved in the most effective way. So right now we're going to be looking at idea validation, and product validation can come a little bit later. Okay, so if we have our app in the middle of the screen here, there are 5 layers of validation around this that I want you to put in place. And we're going to start with the absolute simplest one over here, and that is identifying your target market. Now, this might not scream idea validation, and that's okay, because remember, we're starting with that very, very base layer. But really, I just want you to make sure you have identified a specific target market that is going to be using your tool. Now, if you're building a SaaS product, then you're likely building a B2B tool. You're going to be selling this to businesses. And so what I don't want you to do is make businesses your target market, or even small businesses, or even micro businesses. You need to define it more specifically, because when you do that, you're going to be able to build a more focused tool that is pinpointed towards more specific problems. You're going to be able to convey the value of that tool a lot more succinctly, and you're going to be able to sell it a lot more easily and convert users, take their feedback, and keep everything much more contained. You can move your market wider after that, but first you have to make it work for one target market, one specific target market. And by defining that target market narrowly, you are going to give yourself a major leg up as you move forward. So I want you to make sure you have identified the type of target user who you're going to be building your app for, the type of user who is going to be paying for your app, because sometimes those are different. And you need to make sure you understand what the niche is. Okay, so remember, it's not just businesses. It is businesses potentially in a certain industry of a certain size, with certain types of employees or processes, with certain budgets, with all of these different things that you can add in. But you need to make sure that you narrowly define that target market, because when you do that, you can also make sure that that target market does have the problem you're solving, and you can start adding on the next layers of validation beyond that. And that leads us into the next one, which is existing alternatives. So if your target market has the problem that you're solving, you also want to make sure that there are existing alternatives of solutions. Okay, so in regard to the solutions they're using. So they have the problem that you are aiming to solve. Well, how are they currently solving that problem? This doesn't have to be with tech. This can be with pen and paper. This can be with spreadsheets. This can be with Post-it notes or whiteboards, all right? But they have to have some sort of existing alternatives, because it shows that there is a need to actually have a solution in place. This can look like employees or hiring extra staff. This can be using software. Maybe it's outdated software, or maybe it's software that is built for certain processes that they have, but is not built for their niche industry or their niche type of business. Maybe their industry is a little bit smaller, so they're using out-of-the-box software and they're having to compromise in a lot of ways. So what are the existing alternatives that they are currently using to solve the problem that your app will be solving? On top of that, I want to add a bonus over here, and that is, what are they paying for? And this is even more important, and this gives even more validation to your idea. So out of those existing alternatives that they're using, are they paying for them? If so, how much? That's going to give you a lot of insight and a lot of further validation, because it shows the importance and urgency of the problem you're going to be solving. Now, this leads us into the next point, which is that your solution, your idea, ideally, it needs to fill a hole. Okay, so we have that target market narrowly defined. You know there are existing alternatives that are currently solving the problem. Ideally, those are being paid for. Well, how is your solution going to be different or better from those existing alternatives? So really, you want to fill a hole. You don't want to copy what's already out there. It's not, that's not the best way to go about it. It's hard to compete in that way, and you really don't have much of a competitive advantage. So instead, you want to fill a hole. So what are the existing alternatives lacking? Now, if there isn't existing software, well, then you are filling a hole just by building an app. But if there is existing software, then you need to fill other holes. Is that software outdated? Is it not really targeted at a specific industry, and therefore lots of compromises are being made? Okay, so find the hole that you will be filling, find what differentiates you, and that's going to give you a unique edge, and it's going to allow you to sell your product a lot more easily. After that, I want you to look at the urgency of the problem. Right? What's the urgency of the problem you are solving? Now, you should be able to gauge this really based on whether or not an existing alternative is being paid for, and especially how much it's being paid for. But you can also gauge this by how much money this problem is currently costing a business, how much time, how many bottlenecks, right? So you really want to look at how urgent is the problem that you are solving? And you can kind of look at this on a spectrum. Let's say we are gauging how urgent this problem is on a scale from 1 to 10. Well, anything up on the right side here, let's say above 5, so between 6 and 10 is a higher level of urgency. So is it costing money? Is it costing time? Is it costing lots of inconveniences, frustrations? Is it costing waste within businesses? The more of that is happening, the more urgent the problem is that you're going to be solving. If you find that you place yourself or your solution anywhere on the left-hand side, that doesn't necessarily mean that your solution isn't needed, but it's certainly less necessary. So you may have a harder time initially launching, growing, because potentially you might not be able to charge enough. Potentially people might not pay for a solution if it's just not urgent enough. And so you want to make sure that there is a sense of urgency in solving this problem, that there are pain points associated with the problem, and that those pain points are driving people to fix them. They're that pressing. So make sure there is a level of urgency with the problem you're solving. And after that, I want you to look at your industry ties. And this one is really, really simple, but there is a group of users who we call your default users. And when you're initially launching your product, you really want to go after the lowest hanging fruit. And when you have industry ties, you have access to low hanging fruit in the form of initial users. So when you're doing your initial user outreach to bring your first beta users on board, you don't want to have to turn this into a massive production and project. You really want to have easy access to those users so you can bring them on board, start getting feedback immediately, iterating immediately, and growing your app really early on. So I want to make sure you have some industry ties. Now, this one might be easy for you. Maybe you're building the app for a problem that you currently have, but if not, make sure that you have some sort of contact or some sort of connection so that you can kind of get a foot or a toe in the door to the potential users of your app. So if you have those 5 layers of validation, that's a really good starting point for moving forward in looking more so toward product validation. So we're looking at idea validation right now, and this will help you move forward more confidently with that product validation. Now, this might sound too simple, or this might sound really good, but you should really gauge whether this level of validation is appropriate for you based on the investment that you're also going to be making into actually building the product so that you can get that product validation. And the next thing that we're going to talk about are the different development paths you can take. And these things tie together. And that's why I want to bring us from the topic of validation into the topic of development paths, because if you decide to outsource the development of the very first version of your product, your pilot app, to a traditional development agency, you could be looking at a price tag of $100,000, $200,000 or more, depending on the complexity. And so if you're going to be doing that, then you do need more validation, obviously, as you move into building that product, because that's, for most people at least, that's a lot of money to spend on the first version of your product. But there are alternative routes you can take to launching your SaaS company. For example, you could be using no-code tools. And when you move into using no-code tools, that lowers the barrier to entry, that lowers the upfront investment. And so in that way, you can move into product validation, which once you have the product and once you have that base layer of idea validation, and then you have the product, it can be a lot easier to really get more definitive validation, because you actually have the ability to bring users on board and charge to bring users on board. And with no-code tools, since that initial investment is a lot lower, if you get a solid base of idea validation, then you can jump forward a lot more easily and confidently, knowing that $100,000, $200,000 isn't on the line. So with that, let's move into some of the different development paths that you can take as you build and launch your SaaS company. So there are 3 paths that we're going to talk about today. And on the very left, we're going to start with one of the most obvious ones that people turn to pretty frequently early on, and that is finding a tech co-founder. If you don't have technical skills, if you don't know how to code and you don't want to spend the time to learn how to code your own product, then you might have started looking for a tech co-founder, or at least exploring the idea a little bit more. And there can be advantages to having a tech co-founder, but there are also disadvantages. And so I want to talk about some of the main ones with you so you can have a better idea of whether this path is right for you. So one of the main advantages of having a tech co-founder is that you get to keep everything in-house, at least as much as you want. So if you're comparing this to outsourcing, for example, you don't have to take your idea, give it to someone else, or give it to another team and hope they're able to execute on it properly. You bring that team essentially, or at least that person initially, in-house to partner with you, and they're able to build this out. And ideally, if you're working with a co-founder, then they're going to have the same drive, passion, vision, mission as you, and so are therefore going to execute on this with a lot of importance, because there's more stake in the game, more care. Obviously, that's theoretically what you would find. That doesn't always happen, but that can be one of the positives of having a tech co-founder, is just that you really do have a partner in this and you bring things in-house. On the flip side, and what drives a lot of people away from going this route, is that you have to end up splitting control. And a lot of people understandably don't want to do this. So if you are the person who has come up with the solution, with your idea, it can leave a bad taste in your mouth to think about giving away potentially half of it, or trying to find someone who will agree with you on everything that you want to do. When you have a tech co-founder and you're splitting control, you're not the one making all the decisions. So while you might have the idea and it might be crystal clear in your mind, well, the execution might end up looking a lot different, because someone else is weighing in on it, and someone else might have a different vision than you, or might have even different intentions than you. And so it can be tough to find the right person. Some people think of this as a marriage, and so it's not an easy thing to execute correctly, but you have to weigh the pros and cons. Is this something that you're comfortable with, giving up control of not just your idea and your decision-making power, but of your company, of your future company, and of the revenue that you bring in, your equity in that? Next, we're going to talk about outsourcing, and that is to an agency. So you can find a traditional development agency, or potentially a single developer, depending on the size of the project or the complexity. But if you're outsourcing to a traditional development agency, we talked about this already, this can come with, it can come with some definite pros and cons, just like having a tech co-founder. We'll start with one of the positives, which is that this is going to be a lot faster generally because the team is solely looking at working on your idea. It's their only job. There's not a lot of decision making because generally you're going to be making the decisions on what should happen. They're just going to move forward with the how everything happens. And so theoretically, this should be a lot faster, especially if you are comfortable paying higher prices, then you're going to get the speed that comes along with that. And of course, compared to having a tech co-founder, you're going to have more of the control. Now, that's not to say you're going to have control over the how it's built or what happens in development, because obviously you're handing your idea to someone else, but you will have more control over the decision-making process when it comes to the bigger vision. And that can be a positive for a lot of people who want to keep control over their idea, their business, their vision. On the flip side, and we've already talked about this a little bit, but this can be very, very expensive. And you have to think about the immediate upfront cost as well as the long-term cost, because if the version 1 of your product takes $100,000 of an investment to build and get up off the ground, well, what happens after that? When you launch, it's not the time to take your foot off the gas pedal. You want to push down harder, and that means getting feedback, and that means iterating really quickly, adding onto your app, expanding it, changing, maybe removing, but really just using the feedback so you can grow your product. And so yes, you have that upfront investment, but you also have all the ongoing investment after that. And so ideally, when you launch and you start getting the feedback, you start bringing in more money to put back into the investment in the development. But of course, we're talking about generally very expensive development costs, and you're not generally going to be getting all of that back right after you launch your app. So that leads us to the third path, and that might be why you ended up on this video today, but that is using no-code tools. And this is something that we ourselves are obviously very fond of. It's something that we do, it's what we teach, and it's what we love because it opens up a lot of doors. So the positives with using no-code tools, and these can be anything from complete development platforms that allow you to build an entire app from scratch to tools that are pre-built that you can just connect to each other and have them communicate and talk to each other, so that you can build out processes without actually building from the ground up. So any type of functionality that you can create and bring to life without having to code is a no-code tool. And so some of the really big positives in using no-code tools are both the control and the cost that is comparably a lot lower. Now with the control, that's actually higher, of course. So when you're using no-code tools, and let's say you yourself personally want to build the first version of your product, well, then you get the benefit of having that in-house development. I mean, if you are doing it, or maybe yourself and your partner who is, or maybe even a small team who are also non-technical or just don't know how to code, well, you can bring the development in-house and you can have complete control over this. And so you don't have to give away equity or stake in your company just to be able to build your app. You can keep that control over your idea, your company, the development, everything. So it just gives more control, which a lot of entrepreneurs like to have. And then on the cost side, that is going to be a lot lower. So you don't get the drawback with outsourcing to a traditional development agency where you're going to have, or you're likely going to have sticker shock from the price tags. A lot of our own clients come to us after having been quoted $75,000, $100,000 or more just for the very first versions of their products. And so that's what leads them to no code. And again, the tools really do just bring down that barrier to entry into being able to launch a tech company without having those traditional tech skills. Now, on the flip side of that, with all of that control and with the lower cost, there is some flip side that you have to look at. And that really involves more learning, because if you have the full control over not just your idea, your vision, and executing on it, but how it's done, the development of it, using the platform or multiple platforms to actually create the functionality. There's just going to be more learning involved, right? That has to be the case. And so that means investing your time and investing your effort into making sure that you're actually able to leverage the control that you can now have. And with lower cost, usually that means less convenience, right? Which means that you have to do more of the legwork. So if you're using a no-code tool and you're going to be building your app, then obviously you're going to have to learn what comes along with that so that you can actually get your product off the ground. Now, I do want to specify though, that even when you're using no-code tools, there are actually a couple different paths you can take within that. So with no-code tools, you still can go the agency route and you can outsource the development of your app to a no-code development agency. And so you're going to get some of the benefits of no code, even though you're outsourcing. So generally you're going to find lower price tags because it is a lot easier to get things up and running. It is a lot faster. It's not going to be cheap if you want the quality, of course, because there is still skill and labor and time being put into that, the development when you're outsourcing, but you do get the advantages of moving quickly with no code. And then next to that, we have what we'll say is DIY and DWY. So do it yourself and done with you. So you can go the route of building your app entirely on your own. Now, if you do that with no code, there is going to be a lot more learning involved, but you can kind of take a step up from that, but lower than outsourcing to an agency and find a done with you approach. And this is something that we actually specialize in, which gives you as the entrepreneur control over how things are built and how the product is brought to life so that you can understand it and continue building, growing, iterating on it, moving forward so that you can keep that control and not have to be reliant on developers or agencies forever. But you are still building it, but you're doing it with someone. So you're not doing it completely on your own. You're not doing it just by using kind of cookie cutter tutorials that you found. You're doing it with someone who understands your idea, your vision, and can help you get there a lot faster and a lot more correctly. Okay, so from here, what we're going to do is take a straight path down this line with the rest of the video, and we're going to assume you are interested in using no-code tools to create, launch, and grow your SaaS company. So now we're going to again, go down this path and we're going to dive into the agency path, the DIY path, the DWY path a little bit more. And then we're going to talk about actually starting to think about your product, scoping it out, moving into the next stages from here. We're also going to talk about the platforms, right? If you're using no-code tools, you need to know which no-code tools to use in the correct way for you. And so we're going to dive into that as well. All right, so when you're choosing a no-code platform, the reality is there are a ton of options. And honestly, it seems like there are new options coming onto the market each and every day because of the expansion of no code. And so it can be confusing to figure out which platform you can use. And so we're not going to compare different platforms because again, there are just so many and they're for so many different use cases. Instead, we're going to look at the overall types of no code platforms. You can decide which general type is right for you. And then you can kind of go down the rabbit hole, if you will, from there and looking at the types of platforms. And I will use a couple of examples so that you can get started on that search, but this is going to help you a lot really on a deeper level because comparing platforms, it just might not be useful for you if you don't actually know which type of platform you need in the first place. Okay, so on the screen here, we're going to look at a spectrum and we're going to look at types of platforms on the very left-hand side, types of platforms on the very right-hand side, and there are going to be a mix that you'll find in between those, but this will give you a really solid foundation you can move forward from. So looking at the left-hand side, what we're going to sort of deem this side is templates, but specifically with functionality. So you can find template-based site builders or even app builders that are just the visual template. So you get the front end design, but you don't have functionality on the back end. But we're specifically looking at app development platforms that provide templates. That means you don't have to build out the full thing with functionality. Okay, so that means you get the front end, it's already built out. Maybe you can edit the front end. So obviously put your company name, your logo, your colors, that kind of thing. But the functionality is already there too. That means the app development platform pretty much is just plug and play. It's kind of out of the box. Now, on the right side, we're looking at kind of the opposite of that, which is a blank canvas. So platforms that provide a blank canvas. So any type of functionality or design that you can dream up, you can pretty much build on these platforms. So you can see there's a pretty big variation there. And so what we're going to do is talk about a little bit more of what's involved with these, a couple examples of specific platforms that would fall within these, and then the pros and cons that come with these types of platforms. So looking at the left side, the templates with functionality. This is really when you're building a very specific type of app. So these types of platforms will cater to a specific type of app. They have to, if it's pretty much plug and play out of the box. So this might mean making some compromises on how you want things to look or work. But the big positive that comes along with using a platform like this is that it really is generally plug and play. And so that just adds a really big layer of convenience and speed for you. So if you are not really interested in having a lot of control over the specific processes in your app, the specific functionality, how it's carried out, how it looks, how it operates, then plug and play might be the path for you. If you really just want to focus on all the other stuff and just get something up and running and, maybe sacrifice some of the control, this can be a route for you. And as I just mentioned on the flip side, the negative that comes along with that is that you lose the control. And so you really just have to decide, does the control matter to you? Do you want to be able to specify as much as you want, really? Do you want to be able to dictate how every single step works, how everything looks, how, do you want to customize and expand and create nuances and, all of the things? How much control do you really want? That is really going to be the deciding factor for you. Now, looking on the other side of that spectrum towards the blank canvas no-code development platforms, this is where the base is there, right? So you create a profile, create an account on one of these platforms, and all the functionality is there at your fingertips, but none of it is in place. So you just have to pick and choose, create your workflows, your logic, your functionality, all of that, your design. So it's all up to you. Now, there are pros and cons when it comes to this as well. On the plus side, what we just talked about is that control. So again, how important is this to you? Do you want to be able to control everything about your app and your idea? If so, coming towards the right side of the spectrum is going to be a lot more suitable for you. And on the flip side, what comes along with that, which we've already talked about a little bit, is always going to be more of a learning curve. Because even though we're talking about no-code tools here, no-code app development platforms, you still have to know how to leverage the tools correctly for your app, your use cases, your goals, your needs, your users, all of that. And so if you have a blank canvas, that means you have a lot of power. You have a lot of options, you have a lot of flexibility. So you have to be able to make decisions right? Know which decisions to make in the first place and just carry out your development. So the more you want to be able to control everything, the more power you want over how your app is built, how it works, how it looks, the higher the learning curve is going to be if you're the one building it. So you just have to balance this out, which is more important to you, and that will take you from one end of the spectrum to the other. Now, I do want to talk about some examples of specific platforms that would fall on either end of this spectrum so you can get a better idea of what this would look like. So over on this end, when we're looking at template-based no-code app development platforms with the functionality in place, the design already in place, it's plug and play. One example is something like ShareTribe. So ShareTribe is a platform specifically for building marketplace apps. So if you want to build a marketplace, you have two user types, you connect them for whatever reason, then ShareTribe is going to give you a plug and play option. The front end is already there. The functionality is already in place. You're just going to come in and put your little touches on it, like your colors, your branding, your header, your body text, all of that. So you're just going to kind of tweak it for your use. Now, there are pros and cons beyond what we've talked about here, so I want to dip into those a little bit too. Now, one of these is going to be the cost, because what you're getting is convenience and speed, right? And so that's always going to cost more. So with ShareTribe, for example, and if you look at something like ShareTribe, where you lose that control, you can put more of that control back in by having a developer come in and tweak the plug and play templates, but that's going to cost you more. So again, you have to balance out which one is more important to you. So we're going to also put control here as one of the negatives, because if you choose to use the plug and play templates that are already available, you're going to lose that control. If you want more of the control, you want them to be changed or adjusted, then the cost is going to go up for that. So those are things to consider. But on the other side, there are some positives, of course, like we've already talked about. One of those is speed. If you're using a plug and play template, you're going to be able to move a lot more quickly. Everything is already there for you. And if you're using something like ShareTribe, for example, which is specifically for marketplace apps, then you can pretty much assume that most marketplace apps, they're for different use cases, different markets, industries, but the feature sets at the core are all pretty much the same. And so if you want to use something like this, you don't really care about the control, you are happy to spend more money, then you're going to get speed on the other side of that. And you're also going to get convenience, right? Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when we look at blank canvas platforms, an example of this would be something like Bubble. And this is what we currently use with our own clients and what we like to implement because of all of that control. So if you're building a SaaS company and you have really specific particular insight as to how certain processes should work, how certain outcomes should be achieved, how things should look, how things should operate, then you might want or need that control. That might not be something you can even sacrifice. And that's the case with a lot of our own clients. And so we really like using Bubble for that, because it does give you a blank canvas on both the front end and the back end and everything in between. So the design, the database, all of the logic, the workflows, the functionality that actually makes your app work, you have control over all of that. And so we've already touched on this a little bit. One of the negatives, if you look at it that way, is the learning curve. There's going to be a higher learning curve. That's just unavoidable. And that's not just with Bubble specifically, but any type of platform that gives you all that power, there's going to be more to know. And that's the case with Bubble as well. And so there's going to be more of a learning curve. That means you need to be able or be happy to invest the time, the energy to really learn how to leverage it correctly for your own needs. But again, going back to that control, that's what you get on the other side. You can decide exactly how you want your app to look and work. You really do have full control, and not just in building the initial version, but in iterating it too. You have control over when that happens, how fast it happens. You have control over exactly which features you want to add, remove, change. All the control, all the power is in your hands, and that's a really big benefit and draw for a lot of people. And so I want you to kind of take a step back, look at the spectrum, look at the different directions you can take. You can find an in-between as well. So for example, if you wanted to look a little bit more inward to the left on this spectrum from having a blank canvas, well, you could still use something like Bubble and use one of Bubble's templates. So you don't have to necessarily start from scratch, but anything that you want to change or customize is still going to require that learning so that you can come in and do it correctly for your own needs. And that's a whole other topic on its own, so we won't go into that, but I just want to show you how you can come inward from either side. And we do have other information that I'll link down below on using things like templates so that you can dive further into this. But hopefully this gives you a strong foundation and some direction so that you can carry further from there. All right, so we've talked about idea validation. We've gone through some different development paths you could take, finding a tech co-founder, outsourcing, using no-code tools, and we have gone through how to start thinking about which type of no-code app development platform would work for you so that you can move forward and make a better informed decision on that. So the next thing we're going to go into now are those different paths, those development paths with no-code tools that we touched on just a little bit before. So with no-code tools, that doesn't mean that you have to do the development yourself. You can take some different routes. So you can outsource to development agencies that use no-code tools. So you still don't have to actually build the app yourself. You can choose to go the DIY route. So you can do it all yourself. You can find maybe free tutorials and kind of piece things together, trial and error, learn as you go, and really just take care of the entire development all on your own. And then we're going to talk about the third option, which is done with you. And this is the approach that we like to take, where you're the one building the app, you're the one who has the control, you're the one who can move forward with the app without being reliant on developers. You can do it a lot more quickly. But you're doing it with someone so that you can move forward correctly, eliminate a lot of that trial and error and guesswork. So we're going to go through those in depth, and we're going to look at what to expect in terms of timing, cost, control, all the pros and cons so that you can make a more informed decision on this as well, because it's a big next step in this process. Okay, so back on the whiteboard here, you see kind of a staircase on the screen. And what we're going to do is divide this into those three paths. So on the very far left here, we're going to look at the DIY approach, do it yourself. And we're going to look at the pros and the cons of that. And then in the middle here, we're going to look at the DWY approach, done with you. And then on the right, we're going to look at the DFY approach, done for you. So this would be outsourcing. Now we do have a it's a white paper, a PDF that goes into the actual costs that you could expect to help you estimate what your budget might need to be for each of these paths. And it goes in depth into what scope you might be looking at and how that might affect the cost, the immediate cost, the long-term cost. And so there's a lot more information that you're going to be able to dive into. And I'll link that in the description below as well, so you have access to it. But we're going to go high level here, and then you can go more in depth there so that you can take that next step. Again, just more well-informed as you go into it. Looking at DIY on the left, this involves, like I said, quite literally doing it yourself, but this can involve things like using no-code tutorials you find online. We create a lot of these. So using those where you can learn different ways to do things, but they're not going to be specified or customized to your needs. And so there is a level of learning in there because you have to extrapolate the actual core process and apply it to your own needs. It's not necessarily just a copy and paste type of thing, because obviously if you're building an app, it's going to be unique. That's kind of the purpose. And so there's more learning and more doing. There's going to be more trial and error. This could involve buying a course, just a standalone course, a series of videos. And this is something that we also offer as well. But again, it's something that can teach you those foundational pieces to help you understand how to go about building your app. But of course, you have to take things the next level and actually apply those to your own use cases, because there are just so many different types of apps and use cases that there's never going to be a one size fits all. So when you're taking that DIY path, the pros and cons are pretty cut and dry. We'll start with the positives. One of these is going to be cost, right? And this is the reason why a lot of people take this path, because if you're doing it yourself, you could build your entire app for free if you wanted to. Okay, now on the flip side of that, of course, the trade-off is going to be speed. So you have to decide which one is more important to you. Do you want to move fast? Do you want to launch early? Do you want to start actually bringing users on sooner? Or are you happy to kind of tinker with things for the next year before you start bringing your initial users on board, or maybe the next year and a half or two? I mean, it really depends on what you're building, the complexity, how much time you're putting into it, how fast you really do want to move. So cost and speed, I mean, these are two things that you're going to see no matter which path you're considering taking. So DIY, it's going to cost you a lot less, but it's going to take longer naturally. Now, on the other side, another pro to this is the control that you have, because if you're building your app yourself, then you have complete control over how every single thing works. And that is a big draw for a lot of people, like we've already talked about. But on the flip side, you are going to have to think about quality, okay? Because if you have the full control and you're doing it all yourself, there's going to be a lot of learning involved, trial and error. That means that the quality can suffer, okay? Because you might not know whether you're doing things correctly, because when it comes to app development, there's not always one path to achieve one thing. There are usually many paths you could take to achieve the same thing, but not all paths are correct. And not all paths are correct for different use cases. So what would work for one person perfectly might not work for another person just because of the use cases. And so if you're taking the DIY route and you are really just doing things by trial and error alone, you want to think about the quality. Are you okay spending a lot more time potentially building your whole product, learning, and then coming back and starting over now that you've gotten to the other side, learn some more, coming back and refreshing it? Is that something that you are okay with? Or are you okay investing a little bit more in a course, for example, that's going to help you with some of that quality control while still being able to build it yourself? So these are the pros and cons when you're looking at that complete DIY path. Now, from here, we're actually going to jump up to the top and we're going to look at the done for you path. And the reason why we're doing this is because the done with you is kind of a combination of the two. So I want you to see the pros and cons of the DFY path so that you can have more context when we kind of meet in the middle in the next step. So when you are outsourcing, that's what the DFY path is. It's done for you. So you are taking your idea, you're giving it to someone else, and they are the ones who are building it. What you are getting generally is going to be speed. Now, there are obviously some variables involved in this because depending on the price point, the quality of who you're outsourcing it to, the speed can change. Depending on the scheduling, the speed can change. So that's one of the things that there are going to be some variables, but generally, if you're outsourcing, then you can expect for the app to be built more quickly, especially when you're comparing it to the DIY path. You're going to be compressing the time frame by a lot. So that's a big positive. But on the flip side, just like we talked about with DIY, is the cost. You're paying for speed, you're paying for convenience. And so the faster you want to move, the more you're going to have to pay. So which is more important to you? If you're happy to invest and move faster, well, then the DFY path might be more suitable for you. Now, another positive to this is the quality. If you are outsourcing, that you can assume that the people who are building your app, assuming you've done your vetting and your research, can build an app of quality. They know what they're doing. Ideally, they've done this before, many times before. They can show you maybe examples of what they've built before. And so you can get a better gauge and more assurance, really, that your app is going to be built with quality. But on the other side of that is the control that we've talked about as well. So you're going to lose a lot of the control because, again, you're taking your idea out of your head, you're giving it to someone else, and you're hoping that they're going to be able to execute on that. And that can involve a number of rounds of revision, potentially compromises overall, because no one else can literally step into your head like you can. No one can extract your exact thoughts, no matter how clearly, how concisely you try to convey them. And so there is going to be a lack of control there. So that's going to bring us to the middle path, the DWY path. And we've actually done all of these as a company at Coaching No Code Apps. We previously built apps for people. We've taken that DFY approach. We have courses and training for entrepreneurs who want to take the DIY path. But what we really specialize in is this DWY path. And so this really connects the two in the middle, and it gives you kind of the best of both worlds, which is one of the reasons why we really like it and why it fits well with the entrepreneurs who we work with. And what you get here for your positives are, number one, the cost. And I'm using yellow instead of green here because, again, we're kind of meeting in the middle. So if the DIY path, if you end up investing maybe several $100s into that, maybe $1,000 even, depending on how much quality and how much speed you want, right? You can look at that on the lower end. Of course, like I said, it could be free depending on how you want to balance that out and what's most important to you. On the upper end, on that higher stair step here with the DFY approach, you're going to be looking at price tags of potentially $15,000, $20,000 or more. Again, lots of variables here. So this is not a direct specific price quote for outsourcing, just to be clear. You can outsource for a lot cheaper. You can outsource for a lot more. It really depends on the speed and the quality, right? You have to compare those two. And so if you outsource, you can find a lower quality, cheaper way to outsource, maybe slower, but I'm just going to generalize here and say, and assume rather, that you are looking for some speed. You want this to happen within the next few months, ideally. You're looking for quality. You want your product to work and you want to feel comfortable and confident putting it into your users' hands. Then generally, if you look around and ask around, then you're going to be looking at minimums of around that level. Okay, so if you want to lower the cost, but if you're happy to invest a little bit more from the DIY, well, then you're going to find your happy middle ground with the DWY. And this can look different ways. Like I said, this is something that we specialize in, but you can be building your app yourself, and you can find a freelancer, for example, who can just be with you the entire way, building it all along the way, or rather coaching you on building it all along the way. And it's going to cost you more than this, right? But you're still going to have the control, but you're going to be able to at least take some of the quality from here. Okay, so that's one of the things that you want to look at. And then the other sort of middle ground that I want to bring together here is the speed as well. Again, there are going to be variables. So just another emphasis on the caveat that this is not a there are variables, there are going to be some differences, but I want to try to generalize it so you can have an idea moving forward. But in terms of speed, and I'll tell you this from personal experience, when people take the DIY path, it's not just about learning a tool. It's about understanding how to develop an app. It's understanding the strategy around, well, what do you build first? What do you build next? How do you know when is the right time to do things? How do you test things? How do you bring users on? How do you get feedback, right? There's a lot more than just learning the tool. And so when you're taking the DIY path alone, that's the route you're going, then it can take a really long time to figure everything out. And I see some people taking this path and spending a year or sometimes 2 years fairly commonly, and really just kind of tinkering along the way. And that's fine if that's fine with you, right? But if you want to move more quickly, but you don't want to invest as much with the outsourcing, and you want more control, you want to be the one building it so that you can get the processes right, then the middle ground here with this DIY path, you're going to find a faster approach versus DIY, and probably a little bit slower than the done for you. Again, we have variables, but for example, our process and the way we guide our own entrepreneurs happens over a 12-week period. So you can really compress from the DIY, and it can be comparable sometimes to the done for you, or it could be a little bit longer. You might find an agency that'll build your first version in a month or 6 weeks, or maybe 8 weeks, depending on revisions and things like that. So again, finding the middle ground here. Now, on the flip side, while those are kind of the middle ground pieces, the big positives with this that go along with that or just build on top of that are the control that we've talked about and the quality. And I'm putting these on here together because they go together when you're taking this path, because the more control you have generally is when the quality starts to suffer. Assuming you haven't built an app before, you haven't launched an app before, you don't understand the nuances in the strategy yet, you haven't used a tool yet, the no-code app development platform to launch your app, right? So, assuming that you want that control, the quality is generally going to suffer because, or just start out lower because you're doing it all yourself, and it's probably going to be new for most of it. But when you take the DIY path, you have the control because you're the one building it. And for us, at least, the reason is because we don't want you to be handcuffed to developers forever, because that can cause a whole other set of obstacles. So you have the control, but the quality goes way up. And that's so important for so many people because, naturally you want your app to work when you bring your first users on board. So that control and the quality really go together. So if you are happy to slow things down and to do a lot of trial and error to get towards a higher level of quality, then the DIY path can cost you a lot less while still giving you the control, right, as you use no-code tools. The DIY path, if you want to use no-code tools for the benefits that they provide, but you still want to outsource, well, you can take advantage of the speed and the quality if you are happy to compromise on the cost and the control. If neither of those really sounds just like the right fit for you, then this middle path is probably going to be a good one for you to explore because it brings in that cost and the speed and gives you a middle ground there, but it still gives you the quality and the control that so many people obviously want to have in their apps. Okay, so we've gone through idea validation, different development paths, tech co-founder, outsourcing to traditional development agencies, using no-code tools. We've talked about platforms. We've talked about different development paths within the no-code tool world and how you can build your app with that. And now we're going to talk about how to start thinking about and planning your pilot app. So this is where things start to get really fun, because you're stepping out of all of the planning and moving into the actual doing and bringing the vision to life. But we're going to talk about how to think about your app in terms of it as a product, your target market, your users, and even user acquisition. We're going to lay the first foundation for that. And then on the other side of that, I'm going to give you access to a template that's going to help you take the next step in scoping the app, making sure that you're building the right things at the right time in the right order, so that you can test the right things, launch the right things, iterate the right things as you go, and just have a cleaner development and launch experience. So here we are back on the whiteboard. And what we're going to do now is look at firsts. So we're going to look at your first solution, your first channel. This is acquisition channels. And we're going to look at your first users, so you can understand how to think about these as you move forward, so you can have really just a better strategy in place and more direction, so that you can ideally launch sooner and start building traction and growing your SaaS company a lot earlier. So first things first is the solution. Now, the way I want you to think about this, and this really is just a mindset or a reframe, what I want you to think about is the problem that your target market has. So the problem that you're looking to solve, and I want you to look at the outcome. Okay, now a lot of people look at the problem, but they don't look at the outcome. Okay, both are very, very important. You have to understand the specific problem you're solving, and you have to understand the specific outcome that your users need. Okay, so we're looking at the problem is really the before, and the outcome is the after. And the way I want you to think about your solution is it is just the thing that connects those two, or rather takes your target user from the problem to the outcome. So remember, we're looking at before and after. Your app goes in the middle. Okay, so your app, it is a solution to a problem, but really all it is a set of processes. Now, when you think about your app this way, it's going to help you in a couple of different ways. Number one, it's going to help you pinpoint exactly what you really should be building. Okay, because when you think problem outcome, you think more practically, really. And when you think more practically, you build based on needs versus building based on wants. And what I mean by that is, when you're building your pilot app, so the very first version of your app, you really want to build exactly what your users need to take them from this first problem to this first outcome. It's really easy, though, to go way beyond that, because as the entrepreneur who actually has their hands on the app, it can be almost impossible sometimes to hold back and to not take all the cool ideas and visions and little tweaks and nuances that you've been dreaming up and to put them into the app. Okay, but you don't want to do that early on, because all of those nice to have, those cool features, those should really wait until you know that users need them. In the beginning, you need to be thinking problem, outcome. And so your app is a set of processes. Okay, so think practically with that. Now, the second way this is going to benefit you is when you go into this next step that we're about to talk about with user acquisition channels and start trying to convert users. Because if you are talking just about your solution, i.e. your app, that is not going to resonate as much as it will if you talk about your problem and the outcome, or rather your users' problems and the outcome that your app enables. The problem is the thing that's causing pain. The outcome is a thing that could take them away from the pain, or that is really the vision where they no longer have the pain, rather is a better way to put it. So if you talk about that, and if you can talk about that in a way that connects with your users, then the thing that takes them from the before to the after, all the specs with that are a little bit less important, okay? Because the bigger picture things for them, again, are the problems, the pains, and that outcome. What does it look like when they no longer have those pains? So I want you to think about, in the very beginning, your solution in that way. Now, when we come down into the user acquisition channels, I want you to think about your first channel. Okay, so we just talked about how to think about your first solution. Now let's think about your first channel. It can be really easy to go into your initial user acquisition and to try every single tactic and strategy that you've read about. But what I really want you to do is find the lowest hanging fruit. We've talked about that already, and use that initially consistently. If you put focus and consistency into one simple channel, you're going to get better results initially than if you spread your focus across 10 or 20 different channels and just kind of throw a net and see what you catch. Okay, so we want to focus on one low-hanging fruit channel that's going to get you the best results early on. So with this, the big thing to remember is that low-hanging fruit. And remember, this takes us back to the default users that we talked about, having ties to your industry, being able to reach out and talk to people who you know have this problem that you know you can also solve. So that is the first channel, or the way to think about your first channel. Now, when we look at your first users, this is where we're going to get a little bit more in depth, because what I want you to think about over here are your early adopters. And it's important to think about this early on, because if you have an entire target market and you're building the first version of your product, your entire target market, even if they all have the pain points that you are solving, they are not going to become users of your app right when you launch it. So when you're looking at your first users, you want to be thinking about who are your early adopters. Now, if you've read the book called Crossing the Chasm, this won't be new to you. But I want to dig a little bit deeper into how to think about your early adopters. And we're going to draw this curve here, which again, you may be familiar with if you've read that book. But we have this curve here, and we have these different sections. So if you look at this curve, I want you to think about this as being your entire target market. So everybody who falls anywhere within this curve has the problem you are solving and could use your solution to achieve the outcome that they want to achieve. But again, not every user is going to want it come onto your app right when it launches. You want to focus on those early adopters. So if you look at the first two sections on the left, what we have here are different user types within your target market. So initially we have the innovators, and we also have here the early adopters. So innovators and early adopters are people who generally are happy to use new tech. They might seek out new solutions. They might have a little bit of shiny object syndrome. They like trying new tools. They're open to new solutions. They're always thinking of better ways to do things. They are visionaries. They can see the future, or they can see what could be before it's actually there. Okay, so these are the people who are going to be most open to using an early version product and coming on board. And if you are launching your first solution to your first channel, and again, we're looking to launch early, build some early traction, then going after these early adopters can help you launch a lot earlier. And so if you focus on these types of innovators, the early adopters, the visionaries, the people who are looking for solutions, the people who they love talking about different ways to solve problems, those are going to be your early adopters. Okay, but we also have the early and late majority. Okay, so if you look at those middle two sections, we have the early and the late majority. So these are the people who are generally going to come on after the innovators, after the early adopters. So those innovators, early adopters are going to be really just more open to giving the feedback, working through any kinks that are there, helping to improve the product. Remember, they have that vision and they're happy and oftentimes even excited to move towards that vision as early users. Those early and late majorities are usually going to wait for that to happen. And then they're going to come on board once those early kinks have kind of been worked out, things have been streamlined just a little bit. And then on the other side here, we have the laggards. And these are the people who generally are going to be more set in their ways. They don't want to use a new process unless they absolutely have to, even if the process they currently use isn't perfect or maybe even has a lot of holes or bottlenecks. It's just too inconvenient for them to switch over to something new. So they're going to wait until they absolutely have to switch over or until they are forced to switch over. So when you think about your first users, I want you to think about going after these innovators or early adopters because they're going to help you launch a lot more quickly, and they're going to help you get that feedback you need in order to move into the early and late majority. All right, so this is how you're going to be thinking about your first users. So we've gone through a lot of steps here, and now you can start thinking at this point about your product, about that first solution, about that first channel, and about those first users. And this can help you lay the groundwork so that you can build on top of it and really just, again, move forward with more strategy and more direction. From there, the next step is really to start scoping out your app. And it's important to take a strategic approach to this because you want to build the right things at the right time in the right order. Because when you do that, you can test with the right types of users. You can launch the right things at the right time so that you get the right feedback. And you can just grow in a more streamlined way and roll out your app with really just with a lot more direction and honestly confidence, which feels really good as you're launching your app. So from here, if you want to dive deeper into that, we have a template that I mentioned I wanted to share with you. And if you head to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. So perfect-pilot, coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. You can grab that template. There's a training video linked in there for you to show you how to use the template, and it's going to help you strategically think through the problem and outcome and solution and make sure that you're building the right pilot app, which is your first version, which is really important because you need to have the right feature sets in place so that you can launch quickly and get that initial feedback that will help you move into that early, late majority part of the curve that we went through. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot to grab that and get started. All right, I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.